So what do I mean when I'm talking about camouflaging? Well, this is a term that I think was coined by Lorna Wing, the great British sort of autism pioneer, autism research pioneer, which has kind of taken hold in the literature and is increasingly widely used. And what we're talking about here are a collection of behaviours used to mask autistic symptoms or autistic characteristics in social situations, and or the performance of behaviours to compensate for difficulties associated with autism. Now, quite a good way to put this, actually, this is a quote from a qualitative study that I'm going to talk to you about after lunch into camouflaging, which is, so one autistic person, when we said, well, how do you talk about camouflaging? They said, yeah, putting on my best normal was how they described it. And there's a famous book by Leanne Holiday-Willey called Pretending to be Normal. So she's an autistic woman, an author who's been very influential. And I've heard a lot of autistic people talking about pretending to be normal as the kind of phrase. You hear terms like passing as well, and all sorts of other things. Or, all sorts of things. But the term I use is camouflaging. So when we talk about camouflaging, I've talked about it having two fundamental components in the way that we conceptualize it. And one we call masking. So this is when you kind of adopt strategies to hide the fact that you're autistic. So I remember talking to one young woman in an eating disorder service, in fact, who had autism but hadn't been diagnosed at the point when I met her, when she was in her early 20s. And she remembered that as a girl, in sort of primary school age, she enjoyed stimming. She would really enjoy stimming. It felt really nice, helped her calm down, it helped her express excitement, so on and so on. She enjoyed it. As she got to secondary school and started to, like all of us, become that little bit more sophisticated and able to reflect on what other people think of you, she kind of picked up on the idea that stimming made her look odd to her peers. And she took a decision that she wasn't going to stim in public anymore. She was going to wait till she got home, and she was then going to have a nice stim in the privacy of her own home. So that's a simple example of camouflaging. Interestingly, I've noticed from quite a few autistic girls and women that some seem to adopt this strategy, often not even meaning to, of instinctively mimicking other people that they're with as a way to sort of cover up the fact that they don't actually quite have confidence that they know how to behave in a certain situation. And I remember, again, in one of our studies, parents talking about how their daughter, they lived in southeast England, and this daughter had gone off to like a Girl Guides camp, and this camp was in a place called Liverpool, in the sort of north of England. And she'd come back from this camp 4 days later, talking with a thick Liverpudlian accent. She didn't know she'd done this. She had just instinctively kind of copied the other people around her, because she sort of felt that that's just what she had to do to sort of survive and to mask her autism. And then gradually the accent sort of wore off as she settled back into life in southeast England. But that's an example of a kind of instinctive mimicry. And I have spoken with some autistic women who said it took me years to realize I was even doing it, actually. So compensation, we distinguish between masking and compensation. So here we're talking about adopting certain strategies, learning certain repertoires, learning certain skills to help you sort of manage day-to-day life, manage life in a sort of neurotypical world as an autistic person. So I think perhaps the most striking example I've come across was, again, as I'll talk about this afternoon, I've done a bit of work with women who have eating disorders as well as autism. And this was a young woman who was in recovery from anorexia nervosa, but she was still in a kind of inpatient, an outpatient setting in an eating disorder service. And as a girl, in primary school years, she'd been diagnosed with autism. She was actually quite unusual for an autistic woman in an eating disorder service, in that she actually had a diagnosis of autism. And her sister also was autistic. So there was a fairly convincing idea that she was autistic. And yet when I met her, initially I would just not have thought that she was autistic. And as I got to know her a bit better, she told me about how when she'd moved to secondary school, she'd felt terribly out of her depth and socially adrift, really, in this world in which her friends were all starting to talk about boys and talk about things that she really had very little interest in at that point in her life. And the safe structures that she'd used in primary school to sort of manage the social world were kind of melting away and being replaced with a much more complex social world that she was expected to function in. She came up with a solution of picking one girl in her class who was a popular kid, who was a kind of cool kid, and studying that girl very carefully and copying how she dressed, copying how she spoke, copying what she was interested in, copying her gestures. So this young woman told me she would go home and practice this girl's gestures in front of the mirror. And through that, she developed a sort of persona that she could put on and adopt and use to put on her best normal, to be pretending to be normal. So that's what I'm talking about when I mean sort of compensation. Now, measuring camouflaging is actually quite tricky because by its very nature, we're so used to, because we don't have biomarkers for autism, we don't have brain scans or blood tests, what we're left with when we're trying to assess somebody for autism are their overt behaviors, what we see and what they report. And yet, of course, the whole point of camouflaging is it's about a sort of gap, if you like, between how sort of inherently autistic somebody is and how they can present when they're camouflaging. So it's a tricky thing to measure, and we're in early days of trying to work out how to measure it. And again, after lunch, I'm going to tell you a bit more about work we've done in this area. But there's been several people, Meng-Xuan Lai in Toronto is particularly kind of sort of been very creative in sort of driving this forward, who've tried to measure camouflaging by creating a kind of contrast score where you try and measure as far as possible how, in quotes, how autistic somebody is, maybe using self-report or using an ADIR, and then you contrast that to how they come across as measured by the ADOS. And so you get a discrepancy score. So you could have somebody who scored really high in terms of their autistic traits on the AQ, but actually on the ADOS, they presented as somebody who had minimal autistic traits. So that would be a profile of somebody who's deemed to be a high camouflager, whereas you could have somebody who scored high on the AQ and also showed lots of symptoms on the ADOS, and they would be deemed as a low camouflager. So that's one way in which people have attempted to get at this. And any study that's done that, and you can see there's a growing number of them, have always found that females camouflage more than males. Autistic females camouflage more than autistic males. And then Michelle Dean has done some really lovely work in this area, observing, using structured observations, the school playground and looking carefully at the behaviors of autistic boys and girls. And again, she noticed that the sort of boys' autism was much more overt in that context, where girls seem to adopt strategies, for example, of flitting between different social groups without actually ever being engaged in those social groups, that she labeled as camouflaging. So again, that also points to this notion that camouflaging, social camouflaging, really is an important part of the female autism phenotype. The guys do it too, but the females, on current evidence, and I'll come back to this later, appear to do it more and to do it better.